Mr President, I rise to speak on the project of state significance, Macquarie Point Order 2025. I've been emphatically clear from the outset. With all my heart, I want to support this project. Tasmanians deserve to have the infrastructure and the opportunities that people in other states have. We deserve to have our own Tasmanian AFL team. Our young people deserve the opportunities that both a team and a new stadium would provide. They deserve hope, they deserve aspiration. However, the government's mishandling of this process and the state's grim financial position made me seriously question whether I could support this order in all good conscience. A government mantra of just get on with it shows contempt for the size, scope and level of community concern that goes hand in hand with this project, and I genuinely hope the government reflects on its approach. Based on the evidence, I still have concerns that the government can actually meet the conditions required by the order and deliver this stadium at Macquarie Point within a budget envelope of $1.13 billion. However, I am not going to stop it from trying. Mr President, right or wrong, like it or not, due to the studious or rigorous approach that I've taken to analyse all of the information available in relation to this significant project, to weigh up the risks and benefits and listen to key stakeholders and to the people I represent, I landed myself in the invidious position of being perceived to have the potential to make or break this. And right or wrong, like it or not, this is bigger than a stadium. This is intertwined with realising the dream of our own AFL team that Tasmanians have long wanted. This is a rare $240 million federal government investment in Clark. This is likely to support our bid for federal funding to support the long-awaited activation of the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor and be the catalyst for other big projects in Hobart. This represents hope, aspiration and opportunity. And this will challenge the anti-everything mindset perceived to be entrenched in Tasmanian psyche. Madam Acting President, I'm also very conscious of the fact that this is supported by the majority of our 50 members of Parliament, at least 32 in fact, 25 in the other place and at least 7 in this place. In my electorate, those for and against are pretty evenly split. So I'm prepared to give the government a chance by supporting this order, but my support is contingent on principled commitments that aim to protect Tasmanians. Given the order is not able to be amended by the Parliament, I've worked with the government to develop an agreement outlining a range of safeguards that my support is conditional upon to protect the welfare of Tasmanians in proceeding with this project. In the interest of transparency, Madam Acting President, I seek leave to table my letter to the Premier requesting a commitment to these safeguards.
The Honourable Member seeks leave to table a document. Is leave granted? Those that opinion say aye. Aye. Against no? I think the ayes have it.
Madam Acting President, I am supporting this order on the basis that the government has agreed to a range of economic, governance, design and community safeguards, including, importantly, agreement to limit the state's contribution to $875 million, with any costs over and above the $1.13 billion project budget to be addressed through value management or additional funding obtained from other sources. This demonstrates fiscal responsibility and protects the public purse. I'll outline the other safeguards further on in my contribution, and I also believe the Leader will table the government's commitment in full during her closing contribution.
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr President, I'm also supporting this order on the basis that, so far as I see it, support provides for the stadium project to pass through what is only the very first step in any development process, the provision of planning approval. This order does not guarantee that this stadium at Macquarie Point will be delivered. Should the order pass through this place today, it will be on the government to demonstrate it can meet the conditions set out in the order and get the tender to come in on budget. It will be on the government to prove it can actually deliver this stadium at Macquarie Point. In coming to the decision that I've reached, I've reflected a lot on our role in considering this order. We are typically legislators, considering bills before the Parliament. But today, we are effectively being asked to act as both a planning authority and the government in deciding on an order that is not amendable by the Parliament. We are being asked to approve, without amendment, a planning permit. This is typically a decision for planning authorities. And we are being asked to decide whether the government should invest taxpayers' money in a significant infrastructure project. This is rightly, typically, a decision, a responsibility for the executive government. So, Mr President, given it is not ordinarily the role of Parliament to determine whether major infrastructure projects proceed, I took the approach of genuinely seeking, on the basis of the information available, to form a balanced position that both enables the government to pursue its agenda and also safeguards the interests of Tasmanians. My core concerns with the project reflect those voiced by many Tasmanians and include the estimated $1.13 billion cost of the stadium. No new revenue measures are established or proposed to fund the construction and ongoing costs of the stadium. The capacity of the government and ultimately taxpayers to afford the stadium, considering the dismal financial position of the state and the limitations of external source funding, being $240 million Australian government funding and $15 million from the AFL. Uncertainty around the economic return to the Tasmanian government and the Tasmanian economy more broadly, and difficulty quantifying the social return on investment to the Tasmanian community, and the visual impact and access concerns associated with the proposed site. Mr President, I acknowledge many people support the construction of a stadium and many people don't. Almost all the arguments that I've been presented with, for and against the stadium, have merit. Fundamentally, the Tasmanian Planning Commission's integrated assessment report finding that proceeding with the project would diminish the economic welfare of Tasmanians deeply troubles me. In meetings with the Premier, I discussed these concerns and noted the things that I would need the government to commit to in order to address them. I worked through some of these ideas further with his office and then drafted a letter to the Premier that I've now tabled in the interest of transparency. My letter outlined my concerns, reflecting those of Tasmanians, and went on to say, in light of community concerns and the TPC's findings, a decision for me to support the stadium would be dependent on principled commitments that establish appropriate mechanisms for oversight and accountability and offset the risk that the project will diminish the economic welfare of Tasmanians. Therefore, I propose a range of safeguards to protect the social and economic welfare of Tasmanians should the project proceed. Economic safeguards, governance safeguards, design safeguards and community safeguards. Mr President, the safeguards as proposed in my letter were as follows. 1. Economic safeguards. A. Commit to a fixed funding cap, a fixed maximum total state government/state-owned business contribution of $875 million for the stadium in cash and or borrowings. B. Commit to a fixed funding cap of $105 million state government/state-owned business contribution to the AFL High Performance Training Centre. C. Commit to seek any additional funds required for either project from non-government sources such as the Australian Government, the AFL, Cricket Australia or Tasmania as head tenants and or private investors. And D, commit to reducing the project scope should any additional funds required for either project not be obtained from non-government sources. Mr President, a P90 cost estimate is the industry recognised threshold for capping public expenditure, and the government has informed us that $1.13 billion is the P90 cost estimate for the stadium. Given this and the contributions of the Australian Government and AFL, it is entirely reasonable to expect the government to cap its commitment at $875 million. A fixed state government funding cap prevents scope creep and demonstrates fiscal discipline, ultimately protecting the public purse. There's also a precedent set for this. Tasmania's equity contribution to Marinus Link was capped. So, Mr President, I'm very pleased the government has committed to a fixed state government contribution of $875 million. This commitment will be tabled in the Parliament and I will hold the government to account for this, as I know the Public Accounts Committee and indeed Tasmanians will. As Economic Safeguard 1E, I also asked the government to commit to developing a life cycle asset management plan, setting out the depreciation, maintenance and renewal schedule and cost estimates over the life of the asset. The fact that the government cannot answer the question about what the asset will cost the taxpayer in subsidies to operate, maintain and depreciate over its life cycle has been a source of frustration and uncertainty to me in making this decision. Transparency and accountability in operational and life cycle costs of the stadium and the actual cost to Tasmanians in taxpayer subsidies ongoing is important, Mr President. In fact, the Minister for Planning, responsible for the order, just a couple of weeks ago in estimates talked about how important understanding the life cycle costs of assets is for budgeting at a local government level. I'm pleased the government has agreed to preparing and publishing an asset management plan within 6 months of the project contractor being appointed. In terms of governance safeguards, I requested the following. 2A, require the Secretary of the Department of State Growth to consult with the head of the State Service before making any decisions on any conditions set out in the order. B, appoint an independent probity advisor to ensure ethical and transparent processes by providing real-time objective advice to prevent and mitigate risks. And C, require progress audits, revised forecasts and cost escalations to be publicly disclosed. My rationale for these governance safeguards was that my critical concern with the order is the power vested in one single person, the Secretary of State Growth, to determine whether conditions are appropriately met. The City of Hobart must then enforce compliance, whether they agree the conditions have been met or not. Mr President, I first raised these concerns with the government in May, and I reiterated them again in October when the government gave members just 5 days to provide feedback on the draft order. While I accept additional layers of oversight may present market risk, I believe both allowing the government to effectively mark its own homework and having just one person hold all the decision-making power presents even greater risk to Tasmanians from a project cost, quality assurance and integrity perspective. It is simply not acceptable for the government to hold itself to account on its own terms. No other developer is provided this latitude. Tasmanians rightly expect and deserve independent oversight of a project of this magnitude. So I'm pleased the government agreed to the governance safeguards I requested. An independent probity advisor was included as part of the governance oversight and assurance framework released by the government on 28th of November, following the suggestion I made through the Premier's office that this be implemented to achieve such independent oversight of decision-making on the project. It is my expectation that the independent probity advisor will oversee decision-making of the government, relevant secretaries, Macquarie Point Development Corporation and Stadiums Tasmania, from the construction procurement process through to head tenant lease agreements. I also expect the independent probity advisor will guide and monitor the process from project approval, making sure it is fair, equitable and legally compliant, while also helping to maintain public trust. Mr President, the government has agreed to require the Secretary of State Growth to consult with the Secretary of Premier and Cabinet before any decisions on conditions set out in the order. Further to this, it has committed to transferring administrative oversight of the Macquarie Point Development Corporation Act 2012 to the Department of Premier and Cabinet to reduce any perception of conflict between the Secretary of State Growth and ongoing oversight of the Macquarie Point Development Corporation. It has also agreed to public reporting of any updated cost forecasts and overall project estimates. Mr President, in relation to design safeguards, I requested that the final design be agreed by the Design Quality and Integrity Review Panel, with particular reference to be given to visually respecting Sullivan's Cove, the Cenotaph Corridor and Mount Wellington sightlines. The government was concerned there would be deliverability and cost risks associated with the panel having responsibility to agree the final design. But I'm satisfied to some degree with the commitment that the panel will provide advice on the finalisation of the project design and that the Macquarie Point Development Corporation will be required to make public the advice of the panel on any changes it recommends and whether those changes will be implemented. Further, the panel will be chaired by the Strategic Architectural and Urban Design Advisor, a role that replaced the State Architect, and it will include a nominee from Heritage Tasmania and a landscape architecture expert. Finally, Mr President, I asked the government to commit to community safeguards as follows. 4, community safeguards. A, commit to developing a regional community sports facility infrastructure plans. A framework for the equitable distribution of funding across all levels of sport, and to increasing the Active Tasmania Infrastructure Fund for community sport facility projects to $26.25 million per year over the next 4 years, a total amount of $105 million, equivalent to the government's investment in the AFL High Performance Training Centre. I also asked it to commit to maintaining participation funding levels. Mr President, my long-held position has been that my support for government investment in high-performance sport is contingent on it also adequately investing in community sport. This, a stadium and sponsorship for commercial teams, cannot come at the cost of community sport. Yet, during budget estimates, it became apparent that this government had cut funding for community sport into the forward estimates by 72% on 2024-25 budget figures and 50% on 2025-26 budget figures. Mr President, I love sport, but I'm concerned at the encroachment of elite and professional sport on government coffers at the expense of grassroots community sport. I have said many times that I do not want to see Tasmania become a place where kids can watch sport but they can't play it because there is simply not enough grounds or courts to allow them to. Despite Greater Hobart Council's asking for funding to develop community sport infrastructure plans for years now, we still don't have one. There is no strategic plan for any sporting infrastructure, and as a result we end up with facilities being built or extended based on marginal seat maths and divisive debates about where facilities should be built. Remember the community angst, Mr President, when the AFL High Performance Centre was proposed for either Rosny or Kingborough. Therefore, I'm very pleased the government has agreed to the safeguards for community sport. It will be of great relief to the grassroots sporting community to hear that participation funding levels will be reinstated in the forward estimates. There will be a sense of fairness and equity when they hear there will be a pool of funding for community sport facilities that is equivalent to the investment in the AFL High Performance Training Centre. Mr President, this is a win for everyone involved in community sport. This means the kids who aspire to represent Tasmania will actually have the opportunity to get a start. Like the Devils, hopefully the Sports Minister might even allow basketball teams to establish a club room in any new indoor court facilities that they are the primary user of, so that they can reduce reliance on government funding and have a place that they can call home. Mr President, I want to be clear that the commitment I sought was for broad investment in community sport. It was not contingent on funding for any specific project. Continuing on community safeguards, I also asked the government to B, commit to delivering a transport mode on the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor, new ferry terminal infrastructure and the expansion of the Derwent River ferry service by 2030 to provide access to the stadium. Access to the stadium is one of the key concerns raised by the community and experts. Further, the government has long promised to deliver on both these transport initiatives. This stadium ought not come at the expense of these projects. It was disappointing, in fact, that they were not factored into the MPDC's project proposal to the Tasmanian Planning Commission. The government has reinstated its commitment to these projects, with a strategic business case for a rapid bus service on the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor expected to be provided to the Australian Government by the end of this year, and plans underway for the ferry service expansion and new terminals. Mr President, the government also satisfied the other community safeguards requests I made, which were C, commit to requiring stadium construction and operational contractors to work with regional jobs hubs to provide employment opportunities for participants. D, commit to developing a buy local plan, including consideration of the following. 1, a target of 50% Tasmanian labour and supplier participation. 2, head tenant, food and beverage, ticketing and stadium hire contracts that are negotiated by Stadiums Tasmania to deliver optimal returns to Tasmanians. 3, food and beverage contractors to be Tasmanian owned and operated and procured by Stadiums Tasmania. And 4, food and beverage contractors to use Tasmanian food and beverage products wherever available. And E, establish a means-tested affordable ticketing framework to guarantee affordable access to the stadium for vulnerable and regional Tasmanians. Subsidised ticketing and regional travel packages similar to Ticket to Play or Wellbeing. Mr President, my rationale for these requests was that the interests of Tasmanians must be protected over and above other beneficiaries to maximise the economic and social returns of this project to Tasmanians. The project must create local jobs and generate equity in labour market and supplier opportunities it creates, both in the construction and operation of the stadium. Finally, it is only fair that there is equitable access to the stadium for all Tasmanians, so the benefits are enjoyed by more than just Hobart-based or wealthy Tasmanians and tourists. Mr President, this concludes the safeguards I proposed and, in short, the government's response to each. More detail is provided in the document to be tabled by the Leader. Whilst I'm grateful the government agreed to these safeguards, of course the questions of how can I trust they'll keep their word and how will they be accountable for delivering on these commitments weighed heavily on my mind. In my letter to the Premier, I said that a letter of commitment would be inadequate, as I'm sure the greyhound industry and salmon industry would warn me. So, Mr President, the result is a statement of commitment to be tabled by the Leader in this place today, with accountability to be monitored through the Macquarie Point Urban Renewal Oversight Committee and reported to the Public Accounts Committee. I think that is as binding as we can get. Mr President, trust has to be earned, and once you break it, it is very difficult to regain. It has taken me a great deal of courage to trust this Premier and the government's word on this. Ultimately, these are not commitments to me, Mr President. They are commitments to the people of Tasmania to implement safeguards that protect their interests. I sure hope the government sees it this way too. I and the people of Tasmania will be relying on the government to stick to their word here, because this stadium cannot come at any cost. Tasmanians will be relying on the government to limit the state's investment, to allow oversight by an independent watchdog, to listen to the advice of the Design Quality and Integrity Review Panel, and to minimise the risk and maximise the benefits to the local community. Mr President, I've worked hard to achieve agreement on these safeguards. I could not have supported this stadium without them. I and Tasmanians would feel and would be very let down if the government was to, in any way, not honour these commitments.
It'll be too late by then.
Despite the agreement we have reached, this government certainly hasn't acted like a government who wants or needs my support on this throughout the process. It hasn't covered itself in glory in responding to the analysis of experts either. In fact, its behaviour has been quite to the contrary, Mr President. It has not acted like a government that is trying to get key stakeholder or community support for the project either. The government has not attempted to, at any level, respond to community and expert concerns about cost, roof height, impact on the cenotaph and heritage and access. In fact, it entirely dismissed them. It has not been quick to respond to any of my key messages or concerns. I started raising concerns about project governance when the enabling legislation was drafted in May, but they fell on deaf ears. I again provided feedback on the draft order to this effect in October, when the Minister's Office provided members with just 5 days to comment. However, despite me meeting the deadline, the order was finalised with no change to mitigate my concerns and without even a response to my feedback until after the order was released. Only late last week, when they realised project approval was on shaky ground, did the government release the governance framework, including the probity advisor I'd been suggesting for some time. Only then did they start taking my other concerns seriously. Mr President, I've also been raising concerns about the lack of strategic planning for sporting infrastructure and the need for more indoor court facilities since I was elected as Mayor in 2021. In fact, I found my copy of the strategic business case Premier Rockcliffe presented to the Glenorchy City Council back in January 2023, and on the front I'd made notes that I'd conveyed in the meeting that we need a decision and action on the activation of the Northern Suburbs Transit Corridor, as well as a sports facility infrastructure plan, and guess what else? Urgent investment in more indoor courts. I've been consistent in the things I'm advocating for on behalf of the Greater Hobart community. Mr President, while I'm grateful the government has agreed to these safeguards I proposed, its relationship management through this whole process leaves a lot to be desired. Its inability to effectively manage relationships within the party is fundamentally why we are here considering this order today. By supporting the order, I know I am positively reinforcing negative behaviour. Regardless, I do hope they stop and reflect on how they could have handled this better. I do hope they handle it better going forward. The lack of respect for members and the rush on last-minute negotiations to get this over the line is far from good governance, and it is incredibly poor relationship management. Speaking of relationship management, Mr President, I know that this will be an important task for me going forward too, in explaining my decision to those who are upset with it. I am genuinely sorry to those who desperately did not want me to support this.
Mr President, if the honourable member needs time, she can always adjourn the debate.
Thank you for just be patient with me.
Entirely appropriate.
Thank you. I really hope that, in time, you can come to understand the reasons for my decision and that you can see the work I've put in to try to make the best of a bad situation here, on the calculated assumption that this project, the order, would be supported regardless of my vote. Polling consistently shows that across Tasmania, around 40% of Tasmanians support this proposed stadium, Mr. President. 60% don't. In my electorate of Elwick, it is much closer to 50-50. I sincerely thank each and every person who reached out to me to share their views on this issue via email, post, text, messenger, phone calls, meetings and visits to the office, because there's a lot of ways a member can be contacted these days, Mr. President, and it is very hard to keep up. It has been like nothing I've ever experienced in my 8 years of public office so far. I've received over 3,200 emails and letters, and whilst early analysis showed around 75% of people writing in were against the stadium, over the last week, the yes emails started flowing in by the dozen, and a late analysis levelled up to them coming in at around 50-50. Rarely do we get emails in support of something, Mr. President. Rarely do we see rallies in support of something. I appreciate the efforts of our community to make their views heard. Sincere thanks to my electorate officer Duncan, my mum Kathy and my friend Nat for their efforts in helping me to analyse all of the feedback that I've received. And whilst I'm on the topic of family and friends, I note the impact that this has had on them too. My family, friends and electorate officer have also had to endure lobbying from people desperate to get their message through. Mr. President, this is grossly unfair. I did say to my mum and dad, your message to people can be simple. She hasn't listened to me since she was 5 years old and she's not going to start now. I thank my family and friends for their grace in enduring this, and I thank them and all of those who have reached out for their heartfelt care and support through this hard time. Community views were an important part of my decision-making, Mr. President, and in helping me to understand and weigh up the impact of yes or no on both those for and those against. I also considered the fallout. How will those for and against respond should the outcome not be as they hoped it would? I considered that those who are against this stadium will keep fighting it, should the order be approved.
That's right.
Should it not be approved, I considered some who are for this stadium will most definitely leave the state in despair at the lack of opportunity and the anti-everything mindset they feel is entrenched in Tasmania's psyche. I also considered the impact if I were to vote no and the order was approved anyway. I decided that if it was going to go through, I couldn't let it happen without attempting to make the absolute best of it. If I'd voted no, I would have missed the opportunity to protect my community and Tasmanians more broadly as much as possible through achieving the safeguards that I've outlined. I hope you can see that I've tried to make this a better outcome from a cost, governance, design and community perspective. This has been my aim in supporting this. I hope the key stakeholders, including the RSL, can forgive me and understand my decision. And I did try and call a couple this morning, and I did reach John Hardy, the CEO of the RSL Tasmania, and he was certainly very gracious and understanding, and I'm very grateful for that. We all have a choice here, Mr. President, if this should pass through the Parliament. Those opposed can blame and shame and further divide Tasmanians, inflicting even greater harm than has already been caused by this sad and sorry stadium saga. Those opposed can continue to stand up for what they believe is right and continue to fight against this every step of the way, because there are so many hurdles to pass through before any shovel hits the ground on this project. If you are fundamentally opposed to this stadium and it is approved, I expect it's likely you will keep fighting, and that is absolutely your right. If you want to, you should. I will absolutely respect your right to do so. My only hope is that you do so with grace. Similarly, I caution those who are passionate about this and grateful for the outcome should this order be approved to go forward with grace. No one should be celebrating just yet. A planning permit does not mean a project will definitely be delivered. There are a lot of conditions to be met here. There is a lot of scrutiny to be done on any decision made that conditions have been met. There are processes to be undertaken to determine the final cost and the final design. Once the government shows it can deliver this project with all the safeguards in place that it is committed to, then it will be time for people who are for it to celebrate. Mr President, regardless of the outcome, I hope everyone will recognise there will be a lot of people hurting due to their view that the decision should have gone the other way. Even if you are happy about the outcome, I ask you to consider and be respectful of this. We all love Tasmania. This has been and will continue to be hard. It is a continuing concern of mine that the issue of a Tasmanian AFL team, something we have sought for so long, has introduced an issue that has been so harmful and so divisive within our community. As I have long recognised, this is a decision with profound implications for future generations, whichever way it goes. This is why I've been so determined to examine every piece of information available and to listen carefully to the people I represent before deciding whether I believe building this proposed stadium at Macquarie Point is in the best interests of Tasmanians. Mr President, I have empathy for everyone who has worked on the stadium project so far. There have been many people working on this across a range of areas, and the uncertainty over these last few years must have been excruciating. I acknowledge and thank you for your efforts. I know that everyone is doing and advocating for what they truly think is best here. I know that the division this has created is severely damaging. Relationships have been strained. My own relationships have been strained, Mr President. People are and will continue to be upset about this. Some will feel like they've won, others will feel like they've lost when this decision is made. Blaming and shaming can be a default response when emotions are raw. But we all have a role to play in repairing the moral injury that has been inflicted on so many Tasmanians, as the member for Murchison described. Regardless of the outcome, leadership will be needed to help heal the division and hurt that is left behind. Through respect and kindness, we can all play a role in this. It is my hope that we all look out for each other as we navigate the path forward, that we can all at least accept views that differ from our own and trust each and every person is doing their best with the information they have to promote what they genuinely believe is best for Tasmanians. In closing, I really appreciate people's patience as I analysed all the information, asked questions, scrutinised the answers and agonised over the push and pull between my heart and my head. I know the uncertainty has caused great angst for many. Mr President, this has been the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I knew I was going to let people down whichever way I voted, and this weighs heavily on me. But the weight of the missed opportunity feels heavier than never knowing if it could actually be done. So I support the order as the first step in the development approval process. The rest is on the government. It will be a test of this government's leadership, integrity and accountability at every single hurdle the project will inevitably face from here. It will be a test of this government's leadership to deliver this stadium and at the same time fix the budget mess. I truly hope they don't stuff it up on either account. I truly hope the dreams and hopes and dreams and aspirations of all Tasmanians are able to be realised through this project and through the work the government must do to repair the budget so that it can adequately service the needs of everyday Tasmanians at the same time. Mr President, I stand ready to hold the government to account every step of the way here as a member of the Public Accounts Committee and on the floor here in this place. I also stand ready to play my role in navigating the path forward to repair the moral injury this divisive debate has caused. I really hope everyone else does too. Considering the government's agreements to the safeguards as tabled, provide for, among other things, a fixed funding cap, an independent watchdog to oversight project decision-making and greater investment in community sport to ensure everyone can play, I support the order.